I want to thank you all for joining us today. The day before winter, apparently we're supposed to have snow tomorrow. It's crazy. We are in for a real treat tonight, and I decided that if and when I ever grow up, I want to be like Diane Sands. Diane received her BA in anthropology from the University of Montana, Missoula in 1974 and completed coursework toward a master's degree in women's studies at George Washington University. She was the director of the Montana Women's History Project from 75 to 90 and co-project director of the Montana Feminist Project from 99 to 04, a project dedicated to documenting second-wave feminism. She retired from the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, where she focused on the history of the World War II Japanese internment, which was amazing.
If you haven't been there, you must go.
She also served 8 years in the Montana State House of Representatives and is currently finishing 8 years in the Montana State Senate. In 2017, the Montana Historical Society Board of Trustees presented her with the Montana Heritage Guardian Award. Please welcome Diane Sands.
Probably the award I have most appreciated in all of this is that award from the Historical Society, because you at least know what I actually have done. But as I often said, did that come with a spear? If you're going to be a guardian, you should have a tool of some sort, don't you think? So I am just delighted to give a presentation on the Women of the Con-Con on this 50th anniversary of this wonderful, wonderful document. And many of you know I've spoken about this topic before, but this year it's extra special, I think, because of the attention of the public is being really called to this celebration, and also, I think, to the danger of the Constitution in many ways, the challenges to it that are the current reality. Right now, as you know, I serve on judiciary. I serve on the Special Select Committee to investigate the judiciary, among other things. There are over 20 pieces of legislation currently before the Supreme Court around constitutionality, and never before in our history have we actually had a sitting legislator refer to the Constitution as a socialist rag that needs to be tossed out. So I will tell you that in my belief, the Constitution is in serious danger of perhaps even being repealed. So I think it's very timely and important that we're looking at the Constitution and its history at this point, not just in a nostalgic way, but as a way to ground all of us in the importance of the provisions that are in the Constitution as a living document, and that it's up to all of us to take an oath to protect and defend that Constitution. For it has shortcomings, but nonetheless. So I think it's very timely that we do that. You know, I missed the Con-Con by a couple of years. I was a little younger. I was still at the University of Montana as a student when the convention happened. But I feel very lucky to have known 11 of these women, some of them really quite well as both friends and as mentors for my own political career, and as sister members of various organizations, particularly like the Montana American University Women Organization, which I've been a member of for almost 50 years and am currently the incoming president. State president, you know, I don't know. But I'm sure a number of you will be as nostalgic as I was going through some of these and reading their comments. Sometimes I'd get a little bit teary in some ways, remembering some of these dear women whom many of you in the audience had personal relationships with as well. So I hope you're going to share some of those memories as we go through this. So it goes without saying that there's no historical event of importance that's outside of its historic context. You know, this did not stand alone. It stood in the times of the 60s and 70s, and I think Chuck Johnson, who's here, those of you who heard his presentation last time, learned something about the general history of the Con-Con, and some of the stories of these individuals who are involved certainly is rich in a great deal of diversity of the time. And we'll talk a little bit about that, where they came from. But something more about the times I think is important to look at, because the times and those factors are the ones that really influenced these 19 women to run and prepared them. So let's start with the simplest of facts. Count the numbers. There are 19 women out of the 100 delegates. When you really think about it, that's really quite stunning in its time. There was only one woman at the time serving in the legislature, but there were many factors as to why 19, almost 20% of them ran and were elected. And I think none is more important that the 60s and the 70s are this period, some of you remember, of tremendous social change and social movements for social justice, and women were demanding larger and larger leadership roles in all aspects of society. I know some of you know those come in waves. All those different issues are often hooked together because change just doesn't happen one issue at a time. The rise of the environmental movement, feminism, civil rights, all of that comes together because as you're looking at injustice in one area, you look at injustice in all of them. And the challenges to authority in that time period are significant. And it's not just on the radical fringe. I was over on the radical fringe at the university for my age. But also the middle class that came out of World War II. The middle class community challenged many of these lines of authority because they were really seeking to modernize government. They wanted structures to be more transparent and responsive and efficient. I think that's very important, particularly related to state government, and also to reduce corruption and cronyism, which was throughout government, much of which was addressed by the governor's reorganization of state government under Babcock, or under Forrest Anderson. So the Cultural Revolution, with all of its aspects, nationally as well as in the state, are really what motivates many of these women to participate in this, and they participated in these changes. And I want to just list a few to remind you of the context. So President Kennedy established the Commission for the Status of Women in 1961. The National Organization for Women was established in 1967. The Equal Rights Amendment was reintroduced, first introduced back in the 1920s, in 1970, and it passed Congress in 1972 and went out for ratification where it failed. Remember that the Civil Rights Act is of 1964, which prohibits employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Actually, they added sex because they felt that would defeat the passage of this, and surprise, it didn't. And that established the Equal Economic Opportunity Commission. The Clean Air Act passed Congress in 1970, and the Environmental Protection Agency was created in 1970, the same year of the first Earth Day celebration. And I think, as you heard in Chuck's presentation, a wave of constitutional reform swept the country at the same time in the 60s, coming out of all of this attitude about looking at our structures of government, including North Dakota that had its constitution at the same time Montana did. So as we look at the profiles of these 19 women delegates, their participation and leadership in many of these activities and in more traditional organizations was really the bedrock of their leadership experience and training, and most of them brought all of that with them to running for the Con-Con. So I'm not going to talk to you about every single one of them, there isn't enough time, but I do want to share all of their names in alphabetical order as they were seated on the floor, with a brief sentence about each at least. First, of course, the former First Lady Betty Babcock of Helena, and we will talk more about her, but she was a businesswoman who served on the convention's executive committee, the executive branch revision of that, as well as on the Public Information Committee. There was Grace Bates from Gallatin County, who was called the conscience of the convention, and she served on the Legislative Committee as well as the Rules Committee. Virginia Blend of Great Falls, who chaired the Local Government Committee and championed the equal rights provision. Jean Bowman, who was an environmental activist out of Billings, and she served on the Judiciary Committee. Daphne Bugbee, who was a Harvard-trained architect from Missoula, and she served on the Legislative Committee. Marjorie Kane, she was elected from Libby, although she spent a lot of time in Miles City. She served on the Education Committee and championed the right to a quality education. She, like many of these women, were teachers. Louise Cross of Glendive, she championed the environmental issues as the chairman and the only woman serving on the Natural Resources and Ag Committee. Dear Dorothy Eck, who was the State League of Women Voters president, and she was elected to serve as the Western District vice president of the convention. Marian Erdmann was the first lady mayor, as she called herself, of Great Falls, and she was a national advocate for youth issues and had served on a number of these national boards that were created. And she served on the Local Government Committee and on the Rules and Resolutions Committee. Navy veteran Rachel Mansfield was from the Golden Triangle. She was an educator, and she served on the Bill of Rights Committee. Katie Payne, longtime city councilwoman from Missoula and champion of self-government provisions for local government, was a member of the local government committee. Catherine Bremerton was a rancher and a newspaper woman from Broadus, and she served on the Judiciary Committee. Arlene Reichert, Great Falls, another state League of Women Voters champion leader, called for a unicameral legislature on the Legislative Committee. Emlyn Sparks, who worked at the Boulder River School, she was elected from Butte. She served on local government and the Public Information Committee, and was most famous for one thing. Some of you probably know this. She's the only person who never said a single word on the floor of the convention. No one knows why, but she never said a word. Worked hard in the committees, but not on the floor. And Lucille Speer, who was the oldest delegate, a League of Women Voters leader, and she was a documents librarian at the University of Montana. And her writing skills were critical to the work of the Style and Drafting Committee of the convention, and as we will hear, also in the preparation of many of the materials that the League used, that were used to educate the public about the importance of calling for a convention. Edith Van Busk, Veronica O'Sullivan was from Butte. She was a secretary in the business world, and she served on the Bill of Rights community. Edith Van Buskirk, a teacher, community activist from Havre, and she served on public health, welfare, and work, and also on the Labor Committee. Margaret Warden was a newspaper librarian from Great Falls, and she served on the executive committee of the convention, and she chaired the Public Information Committee, about which we will hear quite a lot. And last, Mainan Robinson, later Mainan Ellingson, who's still a living advocate of the Constitution. She was the youngest delegate. She was a graduate student when she ran from the University of Montana, and is best known as the co-author with Bob Campbell of the preamble of the Constitution. And so more about some of these women and how they interacted as we go on through this. So we got 19 women here, aged 24 to 73, slightly younger than all of the male delegates. They are all white. They are all predominantly middle class. None of them that I have been able to identify, I don't think, were low income. None of them are Native Americans or African Americans. Most of them were married or had been married, and 11 of them list housewife as at least one of their occupations. All had some kind of an advanced education, from a couple of them who had attended business school, like Betty Babcock, to the majority who were actually college graduates, and a few with advanced degrees, like Daphne Bugby's degree from Harvard in architecture. Of the women in the paid labor force, work as a teacher or an educator was the most common, and a few, like Betty Babcock, were in the family business, either ranching or, in Betty's business, hotel management and trucking. Grace Bates of Bozeman listed herself as a farmer's wife and public servant. But in that era, it was really the expectation of educated middle-class women of that day that most of those women, upon marriage, if they could afford it, particularly if they were married to a man who had a decent job, were expected to work at home, running a household and raising the children, and this is the big and, they were really an expectation that they would devote themselves to volunteer community work of some kind, ranging from parent-teacher organizations, activities in church, military auxiliaries, ag support groups, serving on numerous boards and commissions in their community, working in political parties, and especially relevant for these women, participation in women's civic organizations that were really dedicated to a community betterment, especially in this case, the League of Women Voters, the American Association of University Women, and the Montana Business and Professional Women. Of these 19 women, at least 15 were leaders or members of those three organizations, and that is not just a fluke. So it is in these organizations that these women came to know each other well before the CONCON even happened. They developed infinite number of leadership skills and practiced them. They developed an in-depth knowledge of all the policy issues that were going to be considered. So in many cases, these women had known each other for a decade or more and had already worked through a number of the principles around certain important issues that were going to come up during the CONCON. And none of this was really related to employment or their profession, as it was for many of the men who were delegates. So it's really a different reason that they're involved in the community and than in the CONCON. Rightfully so, the League of Women Voters is really credited with, I think, the most instrumental role in the calling of the convention, and then the role they played as 11 of their members were elected delegates, and then finally in the effort that we'll talk about to go out and actually secure the ratification by barnstorming across the state. And I think Chuck and others, anyone who talks about the CONCON talks about the League's role in doing that work. Okay, number 2. Watch this. Let's see if she can do it. All right, there you go. Woo! Luddite. Okay, these 3 organizations had been in Montana since the suffrage days or earlier. AAUW started at the U of M in 1909, and it's an 1880s organization. The League of Women Voters is the direct descendant of the suffrage organizations. They became the League of Women Voters in the early 20s, and so does BPW, Business and Professional Women. And together at that time, they had over 2,000 members across the state, in small towns and big communities as well. All 3 shared a common commitment to engaging in public policy advocacy. As nonpartisan organizations, they were all pretty scrupulously not involved in party politics. And while they had a lot of overlapping interests, they had slightly different takes on it based on their constituents. So AUW, women who graduated from college, many of them were teachers. They were deeply committed to educational equity as a priority issue. Business and professional women were very much supporting the needs and the work of women who were in the paid labor force. So equal pay and other equity issues for working women were particularly their focus. And the League had the broadest interest beyond all of that. And as Dorothy Eck said from Bozeman, I enjoyed people who were talking about issues and not recipes or baby formulas. My mother once said a similar thing. Just can't stand that gossip. So the League's focused on study topics that were selected at a state level, and they involve these in-depth 2-year or longer study plans. So they would choose a topic at a state level, they would research it, every one of the branches, they would debate them, they would prepare all kinds of official documents, and they would usually adopt an official position paper on that. Topics as wide-ranging as school quality, fair housing, water quality, land use, childcare, equal pay, the United Nations, and wilderness. And those were all the issues of the day. In 1953, in fact, the League had conducted a study of Montana government, including the need for executive branch reorganization. So they were ahead of the game on that. And they were instrumental to that state reorganization in 1970 under Governor Forrest Anderson. They, as well as AUW, acted as observers. They had observer corps at public meetings. At the local level and at the state level, they would show up and take notes and just watch what was going on. And they were prolific at preparing educational materials, including nonpartisan forums for the voters and getting out the vote efforts. So they were really on-the-ground activists in that sense. And as Jean Anderson, who was in '72 the State League president, said, the League of Women Voters is the cheapest education you could buy. And I think they still are. Lydia Weideman from Butte stated that the League, quote, was not for armchair philosophers or the impatient. And Dorothy Eck, state president from '67 to '71, said the League attracted, quote, a lot of strong, able women who were educated and serious about getting something done. I think that is certainly a good definition of the League. And that includes things like in '67, Dorothy Eck and Daphne Bugbee, who were leaders of the League at the state level, became full-time legislative citizen, nonpartisan lobbyists. And they said they were the first to have done that. Well, during the suffrage era, there were full-time lobbyists up there as well, but not since the teens had there been full-time lobbyists on behalf of these issues up there. So they were busy communicating important things that had happened in the legislature to the public, getting a first-hand view on the shortcomings of the government, and also they even set up a public kiosk down in the rotunda to educate people who were just walking by about what was going on. And I wanted to give you a chance to look at a great little video. Do you want to start that, Martha? Thank Martha here for all the technology. She's fabulous. This turned out to be the Jean Bowman from the League of Women Voters, an interview with Evan Barrett about kind of the road to the Constitution from the League perspective.
You were really, really active, seemed almost full-time in the League of Women Voters back at that time and what you were doing. Tell us about what happened back there in the Billings and eastern Montana areas you tried to push forward on this idea.
Well, you may know that the League of Women Voters does not take a position on any candidate, but we do take positions on issues. But before we take a position, we have what we call a study of the issue. And we decided that we would make whether or not Montana needed a new constitution the subject of our issue to be studied at that particular time, which was in the late 60s. And I was chosen in Billings to be the chairman of that committee. And so I spent a lot of time reading the old Constitution, putting things together about why I thought, and of course there was a committee working with me, why we thought we should come out in favor of having a new Constitution. And the state league, then each unit of the state leagues in the various towns were doing the same thing. And as a group, we decided that yes, indeed, the League of Women Voters of Montana was going to support and push for a new constitution.
Well, you know, if you think about it, having the politically...
So for those of you who are friends, wonderful to see Jean there. So as she said, this in-depth work was really done by the League, and in many ways spearheaded by one particular League person, Lucille Speer. And as the documents librarian at the University of Montana, she was the person who really led all the research and writing for the League's document, A Better Constitution for a Better Government, a study of the Montana Constitution, which they published in '69. So it isn't surprising, though, that when the official Montana Constitution Revision Commission, there are so many names of these groups, they're kind of mind-boggling, was established, Dorothy Eck was on the leadership team as secretary, and the commission relied on much of the League's expertise in conducting the public education campaign to pass the referendum that authorized the calling of the CONCON. So another League member from Missoula, Daphne Bugbee, recalled that the League members they went out to get this actually to pass to be able to call. They went to public fairs, parades, public events, and they wore nifty little red, white, and blue outfits, apparently coordinated, with sandwich boards or vests that stated, "Vote yes for Constitutional Convention. Give Montana a chance. Vote for better government." They knew how to sell it. As the League worked for the calling of the CONCON, they also developed the specific revisions that they wanted to see happen, including the inclusion of the Bill of Rights. They insisted that a Bill of Rights should include a right to a clean and healthful environment, as well as anti-discrimination language. So they really had a common vision, but they had developed all these policy positions that were going to serve all of these members as they went into the convention. I don't think anyone could make the claim that the men as a group really had developed this kind of almost agenda for what they wanted to see enacted. Not that they got it all, but they did it. And people like Daphne Bugbee said that it was her League involvement that was really critical to preparing her with really deep knowledge about the issues that came before the convention. Arlene Reichert, also from a League member, and had been a lobbyist of the legislature, and she said that her experience with the legislature had proven to her how dysfunctional the legislature was and that no one in the public had any idea about what was going on over there. Well, I'm not sure that's still not the case, but she actually created a television legislative report for the League that gave the public information about hearings and topics that were up, and all of that really prepared her in many ways for being a delegate of the convention. So the road is fairly similar for many of these women who were AAUW members or BPW. As I said, for AAUW, starting in the 60s, it became more of an activist organization focused on public policy around education and economic equity for women and girls. One member said, "There are things to be done which money and men will never provide." And in 1965, a number of AUW members were appointed by Governor Tim Babcock to his new state commission on the status of women, which happened all over across the country. And in 1967, AUW formed their own Status of Women committee involving a whole coalition of other women's organizations. And their goal was to get women to be appointed to elected office, encourage them to run to office, and to keep the state superintendent of public schools job in the hands of women. Like the League, they had branches that were observers in local schools. They developed leadership training programs, and they really promoted the idea that women brought something different to office and needed to be heard. They did all the in-depth studies as well: equity in childcare, public kindergartens, mental health issues, educational reform, environmental issues. And they lobbied for those issues, partly by starting in 1965 legislative lobby days, which we still do, where they would bring their members up here to the Capitol and educate them on the process. Three of the League AUW members in the CONCON were Mainan Ellingson, Lynn Sparks from Butte, and Louise Cross from Glendive. And BPW wasn't as strong an organization, but as I said, they had many of the similar goals and did a fair amount of work on specific issues of concern to them. Delegate Marge Kane from Libby was one of the Miles City, or one of the members of BPW, as was Virginia Blend from Great Falls. In summary, the women of the CONCON, they didn't just arise out of anywhere, but they came out of that rich cultural stew that was going on at the time that prepared them for the leadership roles that they took. Their qualifications were not for personal gain, which I must say for many of the men in the CONCON, it really was part of their professional life, and personal gain is involved to some degree in that. That's really not the case for these women. It really is about a commitment to good government. I want to raise another possibility of why so many women got elected to it, and I think it was because of the genius to say that no one who currently held office could be elected to it. And because of that, it created a social space there that wasn't already occupied by the political elites, et cetera. And so that would be one reason why these women had a better chance, and other newcomers, and they're not beholden to the traditional parties or political powers. Arlene Reichert, however, she'd commented that she thought because of that there was very little of the patronizing attitude toward women, which she credited to the lack of elected officials, that everyone was on equal footing. Now, that said, all the women didn't perceive it quite that way, and they were quite aware that they were quite unique here, and that men were not used to dealing with women as political equals. They weren't part of the political elite, they brought something different. Issues range from things as simple as they may sound as the assumption that all the delegates were men. So like Dorothy Eck would get things addressed to Mr. Dorothy Eck. I gotta tell you, I still occasionally get something addressed to Mr. Diane Sands. They established dress protocols for women that permitted them to wear dressy pantsuits and established what they would even wear to social events. And of course, the perennial issue of bathrooms came up. At the time, there were, the male delegates quickly put up a bathroom sign on the closest bathroom to them, which is not out in the public space, forcing the women to go out into the public where all the lobbyists are and grab one of the other bathrooms and scotch tape up a woman's sign on that bathroom for their own use. And it isn't until that grand person, Pat Regan from Billings, had a fit a few years later that we actually had a women's bathroom created, not out in the middle of everybody else. Other more serious issues around this dynamic of men and women were there. At the first organizational meeting, Delegate Jean Bowman wrote to Dorothy Eck, and she said, "I don't like being patted on the shoulder or called kiddo. That's the nickname I've acquired from some of the delegates here. Also, I think that women must not give the impression that they are a block, as I think that will make men even more suspicious, or whatever they are of us. I seriously doubt we ever would." Yes, the women delegates were aware that they had to really prove themselves in this environment, but they really had the support of each other, and I think that was important to their being able to claim that space, rightfully so, as equals, and to demand the respect that they were owed. But it was a challenge. Dorothy Eck had stated, "The women didn't feel intimidated at all. Most of them came with a better understanding of the issues that we were facing than most of the men, because most of the women had actually read all the papers we had given them. And they were conversant on the issues. I think that gave them quite a bit of self-assurance. I am sure it did." Arlene Reichert commented that she thought some of the women were the smartest delegates and that women had held their own. She said that whenever there was need for an expert opinion, particularly on the floor, delegates were most often to turn to Mainan Ellingson, the youngest delegate, because she was so respected for her thorough research and her thoughtful opinions. this is the governorship of the committee. And Dorothy Eck is the furthest one over there, who's the vice president from the Western District. And I've lost my mind here for a minute. Jean Bowman over here is the secretary. And that's pretty remarkable. That's 2 out of 5. So that leadership team is really as representative in its time of equity in leadership as that we have in our time. And I think that's something to really notice. And women served on almost all the committees, and they did chair some of the committees, although I think the most interesting, of course, is Louise Cross, who was the only woman on the Natural Resources and Ag Committee and chaired that committee. And that was because of really her state leadership already in environmental issues. So I'm not going to talk a lot about everyone, but let me focus on 4 of these women: Dorothy Eck, Louise Cross, Betty Babcock, and Mainan Ellingson. As I just said, Louise Cross, what a sweet woman. She identified herself as a civic worker and homemaker. She was the chair of the Natural Resources and Ag Committee. She was very active in the community in Glendive on a lot of issues, but she's particularly known there for the establishment of the museum. She was the leader of the Glendive branch of AUW, in which she had thoroughly researched environmental issues, which were at the time a enormously hot topic in eastern Montana because coal strip was being developed. So this mother of 6 was deeply concerned about strip mining and environmental hazards. She led a 2.5-year study of strip mining. She brought women from other branches of AUW, including like Harriet Malloy from the Helena AUW, to coal strip for different kinds of tours. And then she led a statewide campaign with the AUW to get the legislature to enforce mining regulations and reclamation, which wasn't very successful at the time, but it was that passion of hers for environmental protection that led her to run for the legislature. She, in fact, proposed some, she was pretty frustrated that she didn't get what she thought she needed out of that committee. She really had wanted them to go a lot further than they went, but in the end, in fact, as you all know, the article that did pass, the right to a clean and healthful environment is in the Bill of Rights, and charging the legislature to enforce many of these issues. And that was the first provision in the country in which that was placed in a constitution, and it's really quite unique to Montana, and having it in the Bill of Rights, thank you, Louise Cross. And so she was really a beacon to present and future generations. Best known woman was, and still is, in my view, Dorothy Eck, whom I'm sure many of you knew. I see you smiling. No one is more individually deserving for her infinite leadership and her many roles in steering the CONCON from its inception all the way through its conclusion and implementation. Dorothy was the mother of 2, wife of an MSU professor, and was deeply involved in a lot of local and state civic responsibilities. She was very much involved in the United Nations Association, and she devoted herself, particularly though in Montana, to leadership of the League of Women Voters, including, as I'd said, she was state president in the late 60s, and was a full-time lobbyist with Daphne back in 69 and 71 sessions, testifying on a lot of bills. She was passionate on many issues, including, I want to mention, the environmental issues, because at the time there was a proposal to dam the Yellowstone River. And it really was Dorothy and others who really made sure that that did not happen. As a League president, she championed a lot of aspects of governmental reform, from redoing local government, the executive branch reorganization that happened, as well as reform of the Constitution. She led the statewide effort to get the legislature to put the call for a convention on the ballot and played a leadership role in those various committees that were researching and preparing documents for the convention delegates. And during the convention, as I said, she was the Western District Vice President on the leadership team and was really instrumental on Article 2 of the Bill of Rights, the protection of individual rights. She championed the right of privacy, the right of citizens to know and participate in their government, the right to a clean and healthful environment. And as a member of the Education Committee, she was instrumental in inclusion of what we now know and talk about as Indian Education for All, which is the only language in the Constitution that addresses Montana's Native population. And Dorothy was very active, as we will talk about, in the effort to get ratification to happen, but she wasn't done once ratification even happened. Governor-elect Tom Judge appointed Dorothy to his staff to oversee and recommend actions to implement the Constitution. And she served as his state and local government coordinator, and then finally, as many of you, she chaired a task force on citizen involvement and became a long-term member of the Montana Senate, where she was instrumental to many of us as both a mentor and as a leader on taxation and local government and environmental issues. In the end, all 100 delegates signed the Constitution, even though nobody got everything they wanted and some of them didn't agree with all the provisions. The Constitution had reserved $45,000 to support an aggressive public campaign to get it ratified, but the court, as you all know, ruled that they couldn't use the money that way, so the delegates were left to deal with their own dime and their time to get that done. So the League, labor organizations, environmental organizations, educational groups organized themselves as the Citizens for Constitutional Improvement. They raised private money, and they created a very aggressive praise the Lord and pass the Constitution campaign. You could get, somebody must still have a bumper sticker out there, I'm sure we do. But mostly it was the women who, because they were free from having to go to paid jobs, engaged in really barnstorming the state. They were on every local talk show. They had local coffees, information booths, speaking to any organization that would give them a soapbox. I thought it was very reminiscent of the suffrage campaigns. They just got in cars together and drove everywhere and did this work. And most of that leadership was led by, as I said, the women who were on this public education committee to convince the public to vote. And it was a tough sell. So the women left their families behind and went off to do this for a large part. Dorothy told me one time when we were talking about this that she believed that the Constitution would not have been ratified if it were not for another delegate, Betty Babcock. Betty Babcock, as I've said, she was former First Lady of Montana. Her husband, Tim Babcock, and they were both ardent Republicans. And they were partners in business, both in a trucking company and in the management of the Colonial Hotel. And so Betty was a pretty savvy businesswoman and particularly had a lot of expertise in messaging and marketing. When they found out they wouldn't have the money to do this, she in fact gave them the resources of the hotel in terms of an office space and printing, all of that for the use of the campaign. Now what Dorothy told me that I thought was fascinating was she said that one time Betty was busy serving tea and coffee and crumpets and drinks to Tim and his crony friends, and they were having a discussion of how they didn't support this Constitution and they were going to work to see that it wasn't ratified. They were just ignoring Betty. She's right there. She's a delegate. They're not involving her in the conversation. Typical of the times. She listened to it and later informed him that she was leaving with the women and she was going to work full-time for the ratification. And in addition to using all their resources at the hotel, she raised a lot of the money that was required, and she went on the road, particularly with Daphne and Dorothy and these others, and really provided all of the highly visible support of a prominent Republican woman for ratification. And since when the election happened in June of '72, the margin was about 2,500 votes, mostly from urban areas. I think Dorothy was correct that really Betty Babcock's active support was probably the one critical person to ensuring, I see Chuck, you're all nodding, that Betty Babcock in the end was probably the critical factor in the success of that campaign. Oh, there's Betty. A lot of you know her from all of her other activities over the years. Finally, a little bit about the youngest delegate, Mainan Robinson Ellingson, who was elected from Missoula. She was a graduate student at the University of Montana in political science when she got talked into running, and like a handful of other Missoula people, she was a member of the American Association of University Women and involved in all those activities, particularly as a grad student in political science that prepared her for her work in the Con-Con. Her impact on the convention, as I just said, earned her an enormous amount of respect from the other delegates, and you can't underestimate that. She was named one of the convention's 10 most outstanding Constitutional Convention delegates. And as I had said previously, other delegates had commented when they had a really complicated issue they wanted explained, often they would turn to Mainan because of the respect that she had earned. She was on the Bill of Rights, again advocating for the equal rights provision, which was critical, and thank goodness they did put it in there, because the Equal Rights Amendment at the federal level, which everyone assumed was a shoo-in, as we all know, did not happen and still has not happened. And finally, most of us all know Mainan's role in the Con-Con, along with Bob Campbell's, as the authors of the inspirational preamble to the Constitution. And of all the delegates, the convention really changed the course of her career. Two of the delegates had really encouraged her to go to law school because of her expertise, her presence. They just thought that was the right thing for her to do. After a couple of years, she'd been taking care of her siblings and teaching. She decided to actually take up that option. And another one of the delegates, Dave Drum from Billings, actually sponsored her tuition to the U of M Law School. I think that's really quite remarkable. She went on to a very distinguished career, as many of you know, as the preeminent bond attorney in the state of Montana, established Montana's intercap financing program, which allows local governments to borrow money from the state at a low interest rate. And she is and will be everywhere in the next few weeks as we celebrate the 50th anniversary here, and I know you'll hear her own version of her stories about the Constitution. And of all the 19 women who deserve your respect, and they did, I want to bring up one other woman who was not a delegate. It would be inappropriate to not recognize the women of the staff who were really phenomenal, and one in particular, Marjorie Hunter-Brown, who Mainan referred to as the mother of this 1972 Constitution. Marge had done her doctoral dissertation on the history of Montana's constitutions, and she was the governor's appointee to the Montana Constitution Revision Committee in 1969. And a member of the League of Women Voters, she and Lucille Speer were the ones who wrote and researched and wrote the We the People pamphlet, which made the case to the people about the importance of actually calling for a convention. And when the 71 legislature, after the authorized the call of a convention, created a Constitutional Convention Commission to prepare all those documents, Marge Brown was the only woman of 16 members who served on that. She later had an esteemed career in law, and culminating with being the dean of the law school. But perhaps the better title she may have preferred was Mother of the Constitution. In the end, that probably has more significance. So I hope these reflections and profiles give you a little deeper understanding of who these women were and how they got to that role, and of the importance that they played in the process. I know many of you knew these women, but I want to invite you all to give an appreciative round of applause for these 19 women who created this marvelous document. And I want to ask you to share your own memories of this. You came here because many of you remember them, and probably like me, you get a little teary-eyed when you remember most of them who are no longer with us, and most of them are not. But let's give them a round of applause. And with that, let's talk.
Thank you, Diane. I just want to say, I know everybody has questions or stories that they do want to tell. In order for our audience that's watching remotely, in order for them to be able to hear it, you're going to need to speak into the microphone. So just raise your hand and wait until Martha comes around with the microphone, okay?
And please take a copy of the Constitution with you. There's a pile of the newest version. This is the old Bob Brown version from 2003.
Yeah, they're all right here by the door.
Okay, who wants to talk about any of these wonderful women that they knew? Well, of course. We're always waiting for you.
I was so, first of all, I loved everything you had to say. And it certainly proves those of us, whether men or women, but still especially women, get together for a cause they truly believe in, do their homework, and take hold of that leadership. We can accomplish incredible things. That's still true. The one I knew the best was Dorothy Eck, because I worked in governor's judge's office, and so did she. But we also had mutual good friends, Dean Hart, for example, who was sort of like a second son. So I stayed at Dorothy's often when we went to Bozeman. And that was part of her magic, mystique, and leadership. That house was a revolving door for all the most interesting people, whether they be highly elected officials or people just starting out. Dorothy and Hugo always made them feel welcome and then influenced them by talking about all the important issues of the day. They had a place at Hamilton. I could talk all evening and I won't do that. Margaret Warden was also a special favorite of mine. I also worked in the Senate when these wonderful women were senators. So as I say, I could talk all day about them and about you, Diane, and your special kind of leadership. All of you and all of them have moved our state forward in the most positive and wonderful kinds of ways. And we owe a great debt of gratitude to all of them and to you.
We all stand on each other's shoulders. We all do. And I'm glad you brought up the importance of the social environment to some degree at Dorothy's house. Well, during the Con-Con, Daphne Bugby and Dorothy Eck lived together. And that was the center of sort of the social life, apparently, of the convention. I don't know, Chuck and some others who were around can probably talk about that. But anyone involved in politics knows that social time is really critical to building relationships with people that you already know and don't know, and being able to, in a more informal environment, influence the way people feel about each other. Certainly, I think it reduced the sense of perhaps threat of who are all of these women, and building some comfort level between different people because they could spend time socially during that. Even though for the official events, there was a dress code of how you had to dress. I think that was not the case when it was over at their house. Do you remember anything about that, Chuck? You were just working as a staff and not invited? What?
I just remember in the governor's office that we were not allowed. This was not Governor Judge, but Ron Richards, who was the chief of staff, that none of the women were allowed to wear pantsuits of any kind, no matter how tailored, how expensive, how good looking, because he was convinced that once we started wearing pants, the next thing you knew, we'd all be wearing bell-bottom jeans and funny tops.
Yeah.
Eventually, he allowed us to wear the pantsuits.
I'll just remind you, for many of the things that have changed relative to women's participation, there still are these constant issues of how do women dress in the legislature, and you know, these periodic ridiculous blow-ups about trying to tell women what to wear, even though men are supposed to wear something professional looking, but nothing to the degree of we're saying specifically what piece of clothing you're supposed to wear. So some things have not totally changed here. What can you say?
What would your prediction be had these women not participated in the Con-Con, and what the outcome might have been?
Wow. I'm not sure maybe there wouldn't even have been a Con-Con. I mean, because of the work it took to convince the legislature, first of all, to place it on the ballot so that people could vote on whether they needed to have one or not. I don't know, I guess I would give that question to Chuck about whether even have been a Con-Con, but clearly the content of the Con-Con would have been dramatically different, I think, in so many specific issues. What do you think about that question, Chuck?
I agree with you, Diane, and I do think the court decision that said that current elected officials like legislators and city council members and sheriffs couldn't run really created an opening that had never been there before, because it had always been incumbents running. So I think that was a big factor in that. And plus you had all the women who were well-trained and studied the constitutions that were raring to go. But whether they all would have been elected, I don't know. It's hard to say.
And I'd love to know at some point, although I never ask, I guess, is do they all talk to each other and decide to run? Did they encourage each other to run? I mean, in this day and age, we would have sort of gone out there and kind of organized getting people to run in all these different communities. But I'm sure once people said they were interested in any way, that there was an incredible amount of support. giving them money to help run or whatever else was needed. So it was a network that I'm not sure among the men existed there in the same way. I mean, I think the professional men's organizations, probably like the attorneys and things like that, had some kind of a 2 cents that they put into this, encouraging certain people to run, but not in the same way statewide that these grassroots groups did.
Yeah, just
hi there.
Yeah, hi, Diane. Thank you so much. That was fabulous. The discussions that I've had subsequently with Dorothy, and also being at, that's where I lived whenever I was in Bozeman, was Dorothy's house. And but both she and Arlene Reichert, I mean, there was very active recruitment and encouragement going on out there. And so it was, it was just a complete deal. I mean, and if they, and I have no doubt that if they did not take this, there would not be a con, and therefore it was probably best that there wasn't, just sort of muggle along there. But it wouldn't have been a con, it would never have been successful. And to do that amount of work in that amount of time, and you and I know both of what we do in all the time at the legislature, what we accomplish.
I mean,
it is a real miracle. So anyway, thank you.
Well, I think it's a result of years of work. I mean, as I said, it didn't arise out of a single inspiration or a year. It was over a decade of work that really went into that, preparing the groundwork for it and the support for the issues that were going to be raised in it.
I would like to point out something that Arlene Reichert reminded me of 2 years ago, and that is in every library in the state of Montana, there is a copy of the proceedings of the Constitutional Convention. And it's either 8 or 9 volumes, but I was looking at one issue, and actually it's pretty interesting reading. So if you want to see some drama and information, go to your library and pick up one of the volumes and just start reading it.
And I think there was a real insistence by the librarians, of which several of these women were, that those materials be transcribed and made available. And without their effort on that, I don't think that would have happened either.
I was just wondering, what was the vision for including Native Americans in the Constitution?
I think a lot of you know this story, that several students, high school students from my reservation, I grew up on Fort Peck, came and were lobbying around. And there was a comment by one delegate saying, noticing that there are no Native Americans on the floor here, they're all standing on the other side of the door like they usually are, outside of the action. But those young students are the ones that raised that issue in the Education Committee, and that Dorothy then made sure that it got put as a provision in there, into that section of it. So we really owe it to a couple of high school students that got placed. Yeah. Important. And it's phenomenal at the time. I mean, if it had been 10 years later, I have no doubt there would have been Native American delegates, and the issues around that would have been addressed in an entirely different way. But did you hear it ever come up in any other context, Chuck? No. I mean, it is one of the, in my view, serious holes in the Constitution. Although the guarantee of dignity and rights for everybody includes everybody, but there really wasn't discussion in depth like we would have now in a legislative session about sovereignty issues and just all of the contextual stuff that it just wasn't there. No one raised it. Yeah, other people. Got about 5 more minutes.
And if you'd introduce yourself too.
My name's Holly Frads, and I just want to talk about the character of Marjorie Hunter-Brown. When I went to law school, of course, she was the Indian law teacher. And then
closer.
My last year, she was our dean. But Marjorie was so unassuming, but so influential. And I suspect she was the same way at the Constitutional Convention. She never suggested how smart she was or how much she knew, but she did know it all. And, you know, she never, ever discussed that she was the mother of the Constitution, because she simply would not do that. But in her quiet, unassuming, but so effective and impressive manner, I don't know, we all loved her.
We all did love her. And I think in many ways, Dorothy had those qualities about her too. Very calming, wasn't perceived as, I mean, she didn't yell at people and things like that. I mean, some were much more expressive, like certainly Daphne would carry on at full volume. But Dorothy, that wasn't kind of her way, and I think that allowed her to be able to calm certain things, provide confidence to other people, etc., that she knew what she was doing in a really professional way. So I think their demeanor was important, and at some point, maybe Chuck or others, there were other women who were on the staff too, who I think played just really critical roles in all these, one version after another, of commissions and committees that were created to move this issue forward. But do you remember any of the rest of them? Diana Dowling certainly is one. Anybody else?
This is a little off the beaten path, but Marge Brown had a really interesting background. She started out with her then husband, Bo Brown, and Gordon Bennett as reporters at the Great Falls Tribune.
Yeah.
That would have been quite a staff. And then she and Bo founded the Big Fork Summer Playhouse. They divorced, and then I think she did her PhD and then went to law school. I may have the order wrong.
Yeah.
But what an amazing bunch of things she did, and I think the mother of the Constitution is a apt description.
Mm-hmm. And I think it always reminds all of us who get a lot of credit for all of this stuff we do, that the staff and the people who don't get that credit often are the ones who just bring immeasurable intelligence and support and hard work to making any of these things happen. I mean, there is. Imagine a huge crowd of support and staff behind those women, both at home and in the Capitol working on it. Yes?
I just want to say I really appreciate those comments about the staff. And Diane, I hope the next time you give this wonderful talk that there's maybe a picture of the staff or a listing of their names, because just as you're suggesting, Martha, just as you're suggesting, they played a very important and significant role. Not much glamour about it, maybe, but without them, it would have been a very different convention as well. Thank you.
Yeah, any of us who work in the legislature know you're dead without the staff, and you better treat them with a great deal of respect, because your life depends on it, getting anything done. Well, time for maybe one more comment. Somebody got something they want to share about one of these wonderful women that, looking at their picture now, brings tears to your eyes. I wish I could hug so many of them again and thank them. So who's still living in here in this crowd we know of? Mainan, who's very active. Arlene Reichert. Yes? You wanted to ask? Yeah, well, who's left that's still living? There are only a couple of them. Yeah. You know, there's an advantage to being the youngest person in the con that you can actually survive to the 50th anniversary. And all those reunions have always been really wonderful place, and the staff comes back, and all of the delegates come back, but many times their families come back after they've passed away. Their families come back and sit in their seats, and you know, look at the contribution families make to those of us who are elected officials now, and they certainly did to them. They left their families behind. These women had kids, you know, 6 kids or whatever, that they basically left to do this work. And that has to be acknowledged as a real sacrifice that they personally also made in order to do this. The men who left their wives to do that work. They just did, and they still do. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question, Diane. You hear a lot about this convention and the results and the participants, and maybe everybody but me knows this, but how did they select the delegates? I mean, were they voted on, appointed? How were they selected?
You ran and you were elected from a district, so depending on the size, the districts were, I think, equal in size, weren't they? And so, I mean, so you weren't elected individually, you were elected as a group from an area, basically. And they ran on a nonpartisan basis. No, they were partisan when they ran. They just were not partisan when they got there.
They used the legislative districts from the previous legislative election. So in Missoula, it was Missoula County plus maybe Mineral and a couple of the smaller counties, and I think they elected 8 or 10. And the amazing thing about Mainan was youngest delegate raising her brother and sister, and she went door to door, and she finished second to John Toole in all of Missoula County, and she'd only lived in Missoula 2 or 3 years, or 3 or 4 years, but she had gotten out there and knocked on doors.
Right.
But so that's also why Native Americans didn't get elected. You had a reservation in the middle of Glacier County, the Blackfeet Reservation, and the non-natives won. And I can't even find evidence that many Native Americans ran. I was looking at the roster of candidates, and
I looked at that, and I didn't see any that obviously were, anyway.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
the Constitutional Convention put in single-member districts, which made it possible, really, for anyone to run in a much smaller district, that they could go knock on the doors. And I think it enabled women to run easier, and also Native Americans.
Right. So all these issues have long shirt tails. But I think it's 5:30, so we should end. But I would say let's once again give these amazing women a round of applause. We owe them so much. Praise the Lord and pass the Constitution.
Yeah, thank you so much to Diane Sands, and we invite you back next week, where we'll have Bob Brown and Dorothy Bradley talking about what it was like to serve in the legislature before under the old Constitution and under the new Constitution, and then, of course, June 15th and 16th for the Constitutional Convention. Yes, and Evan Barrett will be moderating that panel. So come on back.
Praise the Lord and protect the Constitution.
Thank you, Diane.